It's much worse. Okay, why would you say that it's worse? Things have gotten really rough for young.
The material on this tape was excerpted from a seminar led by Landmark Worldwide, where they work with participants to develop the distinctions of effective action and accomplishment. I want to introduce a distinction still in the domain of being. I want to introduce a distinction called silence, the silence or the drift. I don't work for this company. I have nothing to do with them. I just did this program 20 years ago, and some people haven't done this program. And in any event, yeah, go ahead and call your local office. But for mainly, this is because there's a lot of stuff online where nobody is allowed to even comment on it, so people can just post up their opinions and stuff, and then it just lives on the internet forever, even though it's not even based in reality at all. Sometimes I mean the silence, and sometimes I'll mean the drift. I want to take you away. I want to take you away. The whole world of language. I want to take away the whole world of language. And I want you to see in a very powerful, profound way, there would be this enormous silence. There would be no stones, no rocks, no ocean, no water, no mountains. Certainly there would be no people. But I mean, literally, there wouldn't be anything like a person. But you see a rock is a rock. In the domain, but you see is a rock in the domain of language. What is it if there's no language, no observing? Because observing is a phenomenon of interpretation in the domain of language. No observing. What allows the artist to see something on the palette that you and I can't see is that the artist has distinctions in the domain of language, not words. The artist has distinctions in the domain of language such that colors show up that might not show up for us. Same for the musician, same for the man or woman who runs a house, same for the man or woman who runs a laboratory. Scientists see things that other people don't see because they have this faculty of observation. Not eyes. Everybody's got eyes. You can take me into a laboratory. I got eyes too. I can't see what the scientist sees. I got a brain. I can't see what the scientist sees. What I lack are distinctions in the domain of language with which to see what the scientist sees. So observation is gone. No intention, no commitment, no beauty, no suffering, no love. Not in the world of silence. That's all gone. Almost unimaginable. But kind of, I don't know, you can kind of get like maybe a little sense of it. So I want to have this distinction called silence. Now I want to have another distinction called the drift. The drift allows for language. And intention and love and risk. All that good stuff. And the bad stuff. But it has the quality of a boat in the water with no rudder and no sails. When you put a boat in the water, it doesn't stay still. It moves. And some ninny on the shore might say, boy, there's a lot of intention in that boat. But really, what there is in the boat is drift. So I want to invent this distinction for ourselves called the drift. You and I are drifting. Life is drifting. The world is drifting. Humanity is drifting. The United States is drifting. The hemisphere is drifting. There is a certain drift, and there's no distinction called the drift. So there's this enormous body of superstition about accomplishment and failure, which has nothing whatsoever to do with accomplishment or failure. It's merely the drift. If we took you out, life would go on. The world would go on. When you're asleep, things are still going on for you. That's all the drift. People want to take credit because the sun came up in the morning. That's insane. There is no accomplishment in the rising sun. There may be beauty and may symbolize hope and then whatever you want, but there isn't any accomplishment in that. Not for you. No, you and I, in the world of accomplishment, do not have any distinction called the drift. So we have this sense of accomplishment and failure in a mass of arena over which we have zero impact. Now, I want you to see that in many ways you are drift for yourself. You are a drift for yourself. You see that in many ways, you have a certain drift. The tide comes in, you go this way, the tide goes out, you go that way. So in many ways, even you yourself are part of the drift for you yourself. I want to nail this drift thing. I want you to know that you're struggling and efforting over the sun should rise this morning. This is insane. So I want you to see that we live in a sea of drifting, and accomplishment is not that which occurs by the drift, nor is failure that which occurs by the drift. When you initiate a project, that's not drifting, that's creating. But the project begins to drift the instant you created it. It starts to have a drift of its own. Yeah, you built the boat and launched it, but as soon as it went in the water, it started to drift. So there is drift, and I want to nail there is a drift. Now, if you leave everything alone, it'll tend to go in a certain direction. Is that clear for people? Now, the question is, how do you impact the drift? There's nothing you can do about the drift, is there? It drifts, the boat drifts. It floats, it goes in like this, and when the tide goes out, it goes this way. When the tide comes in, it goes that way. And goes back and forth, and sometimes it gets so far out, it gets out of the way of the tide, and it can't get back in. And then it drifts out in the ocean, and the waves get big, and it goes up and down, but it's just drifting. Lots of action. By the way, that's the you need to know. That's the you need to know. I didn't mention that when things are drifting, there's there could be an enormous amount of action. Lots of the most actiony actions are part of the drift. Now, my question is, I don't know about your question, but my question is, what impacts the drift? When I'm considering the distinction of accomplishment, my question is, what impacts the drift? So that's the question. What impacts the drift? Claudia says, I say it's the pre-choice of commitment. Okay, now look, I want to be real clear about something, Claudia, that what you gave us is an intelligent, sensible answer. And I'm going to attack it brutally. So I don't want you to feel like I'm attacking you because you're an intelligent, sensitive woman. I'm attacking it because I want to kill that culture. You stand on the shore with a mighty commitment to alter the drift of that sailboat or that great ship of state, as Bucky called it. Nothing happens. It keeps on drifting. Commitment doesn't alter the drift, but you got a lot. Claudia, thank you. I'm going to get even worse, and I don't want you to be the target, really. I want you to see how much voodoo there is in this culture. People saying my commitment, that's what made it happen. Your commitment makes nothing happen. Zero, never, no, not nothing. The drift of the ship is impacted by your commitment or your stand or your feelings, no matter how deeply heartfelt or anything else. Only one thing impacts the drift. Now, if this one drifts into that one, they impact each other, but that's all part of the drift, yes? So I'm not talking about when the two ships collide. That's all part of the drift. But really, what impacts the drift? Which your life is. The drift which life is. The drift which your family is. The drift which your relationships drift. They've got a life of their own. Projects drift. They've got a life of their own. Life drifts. What impacts the drift is no accomplishment. If the boat biffs into the slip and the wind blows the lines around the cleats and ties it up, you don't have any accomplishment for having docked the boat. If the boat drifts past the rocks, you have no accomplishment for keeping the boat off the rocks. Now, it's true, okay, you pushed the boat, you gave it a start, but for thereafter, it's a drift, isn't it? It's really now part of the drift. Just like Jasmine said, you create the project, but then it begins to have a drift of its own. True, it wouldn't be drifting at all if you hadn't shoved it analogously, but it begins to drift. The question is, what impacts the drift? John answers, what impacts the drift? What impacts, John? Yes, sorry, ship is the, okay, I need a non-analogous, he's making another analogy about the analogy, so I need another non-analogous. Wait, but let's take what John said. Oh, he was talking about tugboats. Ship is pulled in by tugboats. So John said impacts the if It's a ship. What impacts the ship is a tugboat. Yes. If the tugboat isn't part of the drift, and you know if it is, other words, there's a certain drift in shipping, isn't there? Jan or John, I can't remember which they said here, called tugboats. And they seem to show up when ships come into the harbor. There's a certain drift about that. And that's all kind of set up, and it drifts on in that way. Listen, suppose you're a manager, suppose your job is to manage something. You can take no credit for the fact that the tugboat shows up at the liner at the right moment. That was all part of the drift. That was all part of the setup. Now, if you meet the tugboat outside the gate where they don't ever have tugboats, and somehow you can make that happen when it wasn't going to happen anyhow, that impacts the ship. But we are talking about that impacts the ship. But we're talking about Rob. Okay, so Rob says, it looks to me like there's two components. One is action. It takes action. Okay. Now let's get that component flat first, because I think that one's pretty clear. Okay, what impacts the drift is action. Maybe not any old action, because the tugboat that was already part of the system that was going to happen anyhow and did happen because it was going to happen anyhow. See, the farmer can't take credit for the action of the sun on the seed. There's no accomplishment in action of sun on the seed. There's no accomplishment in the action of sun on the seed. Is that clear? So, it's not just any old action, it's a certain kind of action. But certainly, action impacts the drift. That impacts the drift. Rob says yes. So action, but the kind, there's a, and I don't have my finger on it, but there's some subtle distinction about a consciously created action, a human being in action. I was just noticing for myself all the accomplishments in my life. So many of them are just the drift. Yeah, that's how it would turn out. That's how it would turn out. Just a second. You look, this is an enormous opportunity to really see how much of the successes and failures and the accomplishments and the failures in your life are really part of a drift. Damn near all of your everydayness is the drift. Rob, beautiful. Yeah. And beyond that, even a lot of the things that I've done that I've considered to be extraordinary are part of the drift. Yeah, beautiful. Look, this guy born with extraordinary talent, he's going to drift into extraordinary action. I mean, when a 74, you ever see it get up close, 747, when a 747, you ever see get up close to a 747, when it takes off, that's an accomplishment. Man, but no, really, it's part of the dream you drift. Something designed like that at a certain speed down a runway, they'll take off. There's no accomplishment in its taking off. I'm not sure if this is Rob or another participant says, I wrote you about my trip to the Caribbean. I noticed this for the first time just a couple months ago when I went to the Caribbean, and outside of my frame of reference, which is similar to Robert's deadlines and things to produce, that, here's an entire culture of people who drink green, Heineken beer and sit on the beach and take care of their families. And stepping out of this culture, which is commitment and fast paced and everything, I just noticed that's the drift there. And this is the drift here. And it doesn't make me more accomplished than the guy who sits on the beach and drinks beer every day. Look, that's beautiful. That's the best one I can think of. See, there's this true false about sitting on the beach, taking care of your family is an accomplishment. No, building a city is an accomplishment. No city, nonsense. None of it's an accomplishment. Caribbean islanders drift in the way in which they drift, and the people in the United States drift in the way in which they drift. Neither are in accomplishment, and there is no quality of accomplishment in either except in the stupid arguments. This participant says, interestingly, since I came back, I just noticed that, I was living in despair every day. Highly accomplished, very successful, but always like pushing, always pushing for the next job, pushing to have people know who I am, know how great I am. That whole thing about how I'm known in the world. And I came back and I saw how stupid that was. And it's been difficult for me to articulate it. Because if you tell somebody, in a normal conversation that you're doing the forward, the action, is like, in my case, to be a photographer and not be out there learning on the door the whole time. And yet I've accomplished, since I got back, more than the period before I left, and seemingly with no effort. I mean, it's just really clear to me that this drift it's all pervasive. Yeah, so very good. That's it. Yay. Now, Rob really covered the waterfront there for me. He nailed the thing. So there is the drift. There is this drift. What impacts the drift is the drift like. What impacts the drift? Like is action. Drift like is action. But not any old action, because the action of the sun on the seed is not an accomplishment for the farmer. But as Rob points out, there's a certain action, I don't know, like intentional action, but not if the intentional action comes out of the culture which you are. that drives you, that shapes you. But like something like intentional action, I don't know, something like that. Well, we're going to look into that a bit more deeply in a moment. At any rate, you nailed it beautifully. And the first thing to get clear about is that only action impacts the drift, nothing else. Richard says, so you're asking what is it that impacts the boat, right? The drift. Oh, so not it's quite what impacts the boat. It's what impacts the drift. Yeah, because what I'm trying to see, are you talking about what will move the boat in of the drift? Yeah, or what will actually impact the drift, in which the boat is a part, really the second, but the first is fine. Okay, whichever one is easiest for the moment. Well, what would you say to that action affects the boat in spite of the drift in and context? No, yeah, good. I wanted to get that, and I'm glad you brought that up, Richard. Let us call the current the context of the drift, okay? How do you impact the current? Let me tell you a way to impact the current. You build a dam, and that impacts the current, okay? That's one of the ways to impact the current. You can stop the current by building a dam. You can also impact the current by building a shape that looks like this, and that'll take the current rushing this way and send it back that way, at least for a period of time, until the current, it'll create an eddy, okay? Lots of ways, to probably 1,000 ways to impact the current, but they are all action. So your distinction is a totally valid distinction. The distinction between the object identified and the box the object comes in, the distinction between the context and the content, but it's as true for context as it is for the content in terms of impacting the drift. One impacts the drift of content by action, content by an action, which either impacts the boat, the object, the content, or an action which impacts the context or the box in which the object comes. But in both cases, it's an action. Richard says, well, I don't remember. Well, I remember. I think I remember you saying context is not about efforting. It's not about you going and taking a hammer and putting a nail in the board. It's an existential act. Director says, notice the word act. Yeah, but I don't want to move when I'm when I said, okay, hold on for a second. No, just bear with me. I think I got your question, and I think I can shed some light into the arena. An act in the domain of content is different than an act in the domain of context. What constitutes an act in the domain of context is different than what constitutes